At a high-profile charity gala, a little beggar girl bursts in screaming, "Sir, she put something in your juice!" Just seconds before millionaire Richard Whitmore takes a sip. The warning echoes a tragedy from 30 years ago, when his daughter died under eerily similar circumstances. As the girl vanishes and old secrets resurface, Richard must uncover who she is, what she knows, and whether the past is repeating itself in the most terrifying way. The rooftop restaurant of the prestigious Skyline Grand Hotel glittered under a canopy of city lights. Manhattan stretched out below like a living mosaic, its skyscrapers bathed in hues of amber and sapphire. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation as guests mingled among crystal chandeliers and white-gloved servers weaving through impeccably dressed patrons. This was no ordinary evening. It was Richard Whitmore's night. Richard Whitmore, 67, sat at the head table, his tailored navy suit immaculate against the polished mahogany. A man who had built an empire from nothing, he now embodied wealth and power, but also enigma. He rarely made public appearances anymore, preferring solitude in his sprawling Westchester estate. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, he would announce a $50 million donation to Hope Haven, the orphanage he founded 2 decades ago after losing his only daughter, Emily, in a car accident that still haunted him. A waiter approached with a silver tray bearing a single glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. Richard nodded curtly, taking it without ceremony. Cameras clicked incessantly as reporters jockeyed for position near the podium where he would soon deliver his speech. His face betrayed little emotion. Years of navigating boardrooms and media frenzies had taught him how to mask vulnerability behind a stoic exterior. But then, chaos erupted. From the edge of the room came a blur, a small figure darting between tables, knocking over chairs and sending gasps rippling through the crowd. It was a girl no older than 8, her tangled brown hair framing wide, frightened eyes. She wore a threadbare sweater too big for her frame and sneakers scuffed beyond recognition. "Sir," she screamed, her voice piercing the hum of conversation. "She put something in your juice." Heads turned. Glasses clinked as people froze mid-sip or bite. Richard blinked, startled, as the girl skidded to a halt beside his table. Her tiny hands reached out, trembling, and knocked the glass from his grip before anyone could react. Orange liquid spilled across the pristine tablecloth, pooling around the edges of his place setting. For a moment there was silence, a collective breath held by everyone present. Then pandemonium broke loose. Security guards surged forward, grabbing the girl roughly by the arms. She struggled, kicking wildly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm telling the truth," she cried, her voice breaking. "That woman, the one with the red scarf, she poured something into your drink." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His sharp gaze swept the room, searching for the person she described. Amidst the sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits, a flash of crimson caught his eye near the entrance. A woman in a scarlet scarf slipped quietly toward the exit, her movements deliberate yet unhurried. "Stop her!" Richard barked, pointing. 2 burly security guards sprinted after her, but she disappeared into the throng of confused guests. By the time they reached the doorway, she was gone. Back at the table, the girl was sobbing uncontrollably, her frail body shaking under the weight of the guard's restraint. Richard crouched beside her, ignoring the cameras capturing every second of this unfolding drama. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his tone gentler than anyone expected. Lila, she stammered, hiccuping. "Please, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I saw her do it." "Who is her?" Richard pressed. "Do you know her?" Lila shook her head vehemently. "No, but I've seen her before, around the shelter where I live. She talks to some of the older kids sometimes. They say she pays them to do things." Her words trailed off as murmurs spread through the room. Reporters whispered furiously into their phones while guests exchanged uneasy glances. What had started as a glamorous charity event had devolved into something darker, a scene straight out of a thriller novel. Richard straightened, his jaw tightening. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with solving a puzzle. Whoever this woman was, whatever she had planned, she had underestimated him in the ferocity of a grieving father determined to protect what remained of his legacy. Turning to the nearest security guard, he issued a clipped command. Get this child somewhere safe and find me whoever that woman was. As the room began to settle, Richard returned to his seat, his mind racing. The glass lay shattered on the floor, its contents seeping into the carpet. But more than the ruined juice, it was the question lingering in the air that weighed heavily on him. Why had someone tried to poison him? And why had a desperate little girl risked everything to stop them? The answers, he knew, were buried deeper than tonight's shattered illusion of safety. The rooftop restaurant had quieted into an uneasy hush, the initial chaos giving way to murmured speculation. Richard Whitmore sat at his table once more, his expression unreadable as he watched Eleanor Brooks, his ever-efficient personal assistant, pace near the podium. Her sleek blonde bob framed a face now pinched with frustration, her usual poise cracked by the night's peculiar turn of events. She's gone, one of the security guards reported tersely, returning from a futile search. Vanished like smoke. Eleanor stopped mid-step and turned sharply toward him. What do you mean vanished? This is the Skyline Grand, not some open-air market. How does a child just disappear? The guard shifted uncomfortably under her glare. We checked all exits. She didn't leave through any of them that we can see, and no one recalls seeing her enter in the first place. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He wasn't surprised by the girl's disappearance, only intrigued. There was something deliberate about her actions, something calculated beneath the veneer of panic. Whoever she was, she knew exactly what she was doing when she burst into the scene. Pull up the surveillance footage, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. All heads turned to him. Every camera on this floor. I want to know how she got in here unnoticed. Eleanor nodded briskly and signaled for the hotel manager, who scurried over with nervous deference. Within minutes, they were ushered into a private security office tucked away behind the kitchen. A bank of monitors lined the walls, each displaying grainy black and white images of the restaurant, hallways, and elevators. The head of security, a wiry man named Greg, maneuvered the controls with practiced ease, rewinding the tapes to earlier in the evening. The screens flickered as they cycled through hours of footage, waitstaff ferrying trays, guests arriving in designer gowns and tailored suits, valets parking luxury cars below. But nowhere could they find the disheveled little girl who had caused such upheaval. There! Richard pointed abruptly at one monitor. On screen, a shadowy figure darted along the edge of the frame, slipping past a service entrance marked employees only. It was unmistakably her, the same tangled hair, oversized sweater, and mismatched sneakers. Greg zoomed in, but the image pixelated, obscuring her features. Still, it was clear she hadn't come through the main doors or mingled with the crowd. Instead, she'd entered via the service corridor, moving with surprising stealth for someone so small. But that door requires keycard access, the hotel manager protested, wringing his hands. Only staff are authorized to use it. And yet there she is, Richard replied dryly. His gaze hardened, which means either your security protocols are laughably inadequate or someone let her in deliberately. The manager paled but said nothing, clearly unwilling to argue with a man of Richard's stature or temper. Eleanor stepped closer to the screen, studying the timestamp. She entered 20 minutes before Richard's speech. That couldn't have been random timing. No, Richard agreed, his voice low. She was sent here. Someone wanted me to know what happened tonight, not just stop it. His words hung heavy in the air. If the girl had simply wanted to prevent him from drinking the tainted juice, she could have done so quietly without causing a scene. But instead, she'd drawn attention to herself and to the woman in the red scarf. Why? Do we have any leads on her identity? Eleanor asked, turning back to the group. Surely she didn't come out of thin air. Greg hesitated before answering. We've cross-referenced against the guest list and staff rosters. No match. Whoever she is, she wasn't invited. That doesn't make sense, Eleanor muttered, rubbing her temples. Even if she snuck in, someone must have noticed her. Kids don't exactly blend in at events like these. Richard stood abruptly, pacing the cramped room. His mind raced with possibilities. The girl, Maya she'd called herself, had risked everything to warn him, yet she'd vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. Who was pulling her strings? And why go to such lengths to expose the attempted poisoning? Find her, Richard ordered, his tone brooking no argument. I don't care how long it takes or how many resources you need to throw at it. That girl knows something critical, and I intend to find out what. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Greg, who nodded grimly. They both understood the gravity of the situation. Richard Whitmore wasn't a man accustomed to being threatened, let alone poisoned. Whoever orchestrated this attack had made a grave miscalculation, and Richard would stop at nothing to uncover their motives. As the team dispersed to begin their investigation, Richard lingered by the monitors, staring at the frozen image of the girl slipping through the service door. There was something haunting about her presence, something that tugged at memories he'd buried long ago. He thought of Emily, his daughter, who had been the same age as Maya when she died. She too had possessed a fierce determination, a desire to protect those she loved, even when it meant putting herself in harm's way. For the first time in years, Richard felt a pang of something other than grief. It was anger, yes, but also resolve. Whoever had targeted him tonight had underestimated not only his wealth and influence, but also his capacity for vengeance. And they would soon learn just how dangerous that mistake could be. The penthouse suite at the Skyline Grand was silent except for the faint hum of the city far below. Richard Whitmore stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a tumbler of scotch in hand, staring out at the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The amber liquid caught the light as he swirled it absently, but he didn't drink. His mind was elsewhere, 30 years in the past to be exact. Annalise! Her name echoed in his thoughts like a ghostly whisper, conjured back to life by the events of the evening. She had been 5 when she died, her laughter still ringing in his ears, even after all these years. Bright-eyed and fearless, she'd inherited her mother's curiosity and her father's stubborn streak. And then, one ordinary afternoon, she was gone. It had started with something so simple, a glass of apple juice. They were having a picnic in their backyard, the sun warm on their faces, the air filled with the scent of blooming lilacs. Annalise had taken one sip, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Daddy, this tastes funny." Minutes later, she collapsed, convulsing violently. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The doctors called it accidental poisoning, blaming an unknown contaminant that somehow found its way into the juice bottle. But Richard never believed them. He hired private investigators, poured millions into forensic labs, and scoured every lead. Yet no answers came. The case went cold, leaving him adrift in a sea of unanswered questions and unbearable guilt. Tonight, as he replayed the scene in the restaurant, the spilled juice, Maya's frantic warning, he felt the weight of those memories pressing down on him. Was it possible? Could tonight's attempt on his life be connected to Annalise's death? Or was he grasping at shadows, desperate to find meaning in what might simply be coincidence? He set the untouched glass of scotch on the windowsill and turned away, pacing the room. His gaze fell on a framed photograph sitting on the side table. It was one of the last pictures taken of Annalise, her golden curls bouncing as she held up a daisy chain triumphantly. Her smile was radiant, untainted by the darkness that would soon envelop her and him. Richard sank onto the edge of the couch, cradling his head in his hands. For decades, he had tried to bury the pain, channeling it into building his empire and founding Hope Haven. The orphanage wasn't just charity. It was penance, a way to honor Annalise's memory by giving the other children a chance at happiness. But now, as the parallels between tonight and that fateful day surfaced, he couldn't ignore the feeling that history was repeating itself, or that someone wanted him to remember. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping him out of his reverie. It was Eleanor, calling from the hotel's security office. "Mr. Whitmore," she began without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. "We've identified the woman in the red scarf." Richard straightened, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Who is she? She checked in under a false name, Samantha Reed, but we ran facial recognition software. Her real name is Dr. Claire Hargrove. She's a biochemist who worked for Genova Pharmaceuticals until she was fired 5 years ago for unethical research practices. Richard frowned. What kind of research? Experimental toxins, Eleanor replied grimly. Highly potent compounds designed to mimic natural illnesses. There were rumors she was developing something untraceable, but nothing was ever proven. A chill ran down Richard's spine. If Claire Hargrove had been behind tonight's attack, it wasn't random. It was personal. Someone with her expertise wouldn't risk exposure unless they had a specific target. And if Maya had been sent to warn him. Did you find anything about the girl? He asked. Eleanor hesitated. Not much. No records match her description. Whoever she is, she doesn't exist. At least not officially. Richard clenched his fists. Every answer seemed to raise more questions. Who was pulling the strings here? Why involve a child? And why now after 30 years? As he ended the call, his eyes drifted back to the photograph of Annalise. He reached out and picked it up, tracing the edge of the frame with his thumb. Was this your doing? He murmured softly, half to himself. Are you trying to tell me something? The silence offered no reply, but Richard felt a strange certainty settling over him. Tonight wasn't just about revenge or greed. It was about closure. Someone wanted him to confront the past he'd spent decades running from. Whether it was Maya, Claire Hargrove, or some unseen puppet master orchestrating events from the shadows, Richard knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth, even if it meant reopening wounds he thought had long since healed. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Richard Whitmore's penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. He sat at the dining table, staring at the envelope in his hands. It was plain white, unmarked except for his name scrawled in block letters on the front. No return address, no stamp. Someone had hand-delivered it. Richard turned it over cautiously, examining the edges as if expecting it to explode. Finally, he slid a letter opener beneath the flap and extracted the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief, typed in stark black font. You were never meant to survive tonight, but she saw the truth, again. His breath caught in his throat. The words struck like a hammer blow, reverberating deep within him. She could only mean one person, Annalise, or perhaps Maya. Both had seen something, intervened when they shouldn't have been able to. And now whoever wrote this seemed to know more than they should about both incidents. For a moment, Richard felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't just an isolated attack. It was part of a pattern, one that stretched back decades. Whoever was behind this knew things no one else could possibly know. They weren't just threatening his life. They were dredging up secrets he'd buried long ago. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Eleanor's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. Eleanor, he said without preamble, I need you to find someone, a private investigator named Clara Dawes. There was a pause on the other end. Clara Dawes, the former NYPD detective? Yes, Richard replied firmly. I want her here by noon. Clara Dawes arrived precisely at 12 o'clock, stepping out of a nondescript sedan with the air of someone who didn't waste time or words. She was in her late 50s, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, and a wiry frame that spoke of years spent chasing leads on foot. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. She carried a leather satchel slung over one shoulder, its worn surface bearing the marks of countless investigations. Eleanor greeted her at the door and led her to the study where Richard waited. He rose from his chair as Clara entered, extending a hand. Miss Dawes, he said, his tone measured but tinged with urgency. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Clara shook his hand firmly, her grip strong and steady. Mr. Whitmore, I understand discretion is key. It always is, Richard replied, gesturing for her to sit. But this matter requires more than discretion. It requires someone who can see what others miss. Clara nodded, settling into the chair opposite him. You've done your homework. My reputation precedes me. As does yours, Richard countered smoothly. which is why I'm entrusting you with something deeply personal and potentially dangerous. He handed her the anonymous letter, watching closely as she read it. Her expression remained neutral, but he noticed the faint tightening of her jaw, a telltale sign that she understood the gravity of the situation. This isn't random, Clara said finally, setting the letter down. Whoever sent this knows you intimately, not just your habits or routines, but your history. That's what worries me, Richard admitted, leaning forward. 30 years ago, my daughter died under suspicious circumstances. Poisoning. At the time, it was ruled accidental, but I've always suspected otherwise. Last night, someone tried to poison me. At a public event, no less. And then there's this. He tapped the letter. It connects the two incidents. Somehow. Clara studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. And Maya? The girl who warned you? She vanished after the incident, Richard explained. No records, no trace of her existence. Yet she claimed to have seen someone tamper with my drink. Someone connected to a woman named Claire Hargrove, a biochemist with questionable ethics. Clara jotted notes in a small notebook, her movements quick and efficient. So we're dealing with multiple players. A child who mysteriously appears and disappears. A scientist with expertise in toxins. And now this silent threat. Exactly, Richard said, his voice hardening. I need answers, Miss Dawes, whatever it takes. Clara nodded again, slipping the letter into her satchel. Understood. I'll start digging immediately, but I'll need full access to everything. Your files, your contacts, anything related to your daughter's death and last night's events. You'll have it, Richard assured her. Eleanor will assist you however you need. As Clara stood to leave, she paused, glancing back at him. One last thing, Mr. Whitmore. Be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't playing games. If they wanted you dead, they wouldn't have tipped their hands so openly unless they had another motive. What kind of motive? Richard asked, though he already feared the answer. Control, Clara said simply. They want you off balance, vulnerable, and they're using your past against you to do it. With that, she left the room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He stared at the empty chair where she had sat, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about survival. It was about unraveling the tangled threads of his life, exposing truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. And yet, as much as the prospect terrified him, Richard couldn't deny the flicker of hope burning beneath the fear. For 30 years, he had carried the burden of Annalise's death in silence. Now, for the first time, he had a chance to confront it head on, and maybe, just maybe, find justice for the daughter he had lost. But justice came at a price, and Richard wasn't sure how much more he could afford to pay. The dim glow of computer monitors illuminated Clara Dawes' face as she leaned closer to the screen, her sharp eyes scanning every pixel. The Skyline Grand security footage had been grainy at best, but after hours of meticulous enhancement, a new figure emerged from the shadows. A woman in a flowing white dress, her movements graceful yet deliberate. She stood near the juice tray moments before the waiter delivered Richard's glass, her hands concealed beneath the folds of fabric. At first glance, she appeared unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the opulent surroundings. But when Clara zoomed in on her face, something made her pause. Mr. Whitmore, Clara called out, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. You need to see this. Richard entered the study, his expression guarded. He'd spent the past 2 days poring over old files and answering Clara's relentless questions about his past, dredging up memories he'd rather leave buried. Now, as he approached the monitor, his steps slowed. What is it? He asked, his tone wary. Clara pointed to the screen. This woman, she was near the juice tray right before your drink was served. Look closely at her face. Richard squinted, leaning in. For a moment he saw nothing unusual, just another guest dressed for the occasion. Then it hit him. His breath hitched, and he staggered back a step, disbelief etched across his features. It can't be, he whispered hoarsely. The resemblance was uncanny. The high cheekbones, the delicate curve of her jaw, the faint smile that seemed almost sorrowful. It was Lydia, his ex-wife, The woman who had vanished without a trace 30 years ago, leaving behind only rumors and heartbreak. She disappeared after Annalise died, Richard murmured, more to himself than to Clara. Everyone assumed she couldn't cope, that she took her own life or started over somewhere far away. But now it looks like she might still be alive. Clara finished for him, her voice calm but probing, and involved in whatever's happening now. Richard sank into a chair, his mind reeling. Lydia had always been enigmatic, even during their marriage. Her love for Annalise had been fierce, bordering on obsessive. But so too had her grief after their daughter's death. When she left, he'd convinced himself it was because she couldn't bear to stay in a house filled with memories. But if she were alive, and here, at the restaurant, why would she do this? Richard asked aloud, his voice breaking. If she wanted revenge, why wait 30 years? And why involve Maya? Clara studied him carefully, gauging his reaction. Not everything is about revenge, Mr. Whitmore. Sometimes people act out of desperation or guilt. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Guilt. Richard flinched, memories flooding back. After Annalise's death, the strain between him and Lydia had become unbearable. They argued constantly, each blaming the other for not protecting their daughter. In the end, their marriage crumbled under the weight of shared sorrow and recrimination. But if Lydia were truly alive, what did that mean for everything he thought he knew? Had she orchestrated last night's attack? Or was she trying to warn him, just as Maya had done? We need to find her, Richard said finally, his voice resolute despite the turmoil churning inside him. If she's alive, I want answers. From her lips. Clara nodded, already reaching for her phone. I'll expand the search parameters. If she's been living under the radar all these years, finding her won't be easy. But we'll start with known associates, old addresses, anything that might lead us to her. As Clara worked, Richard remained frozen in place, staring at the image on the screen. The woman in white looked hauntingly serene, almost ethereal. Was it really Lydia, or someone who bore an eerie resemblance to her? Either way, her presence raised more questions than it answered. And then there was the matter of the letter, the chilling message that tied last night's events to Annalise's death. She saw the truth. Again. If Lydia were somehow connected to both incidents, what truth had she uncovered? What secrets had she kept hidden all these years? Richard's thoughts turned to Maya, the mysterious child who had risked everything to stop him from drinking the poison juice. Could she have been working with Lydia? Or was she another pawn in a much larger game? Whatever the case, one thing was clear. The web of deception surrounding him was growing tighter. Every revelation brought him closer to the truth, but also deeper into danger. He glanced at Clara, who was now speaking quietly into her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. For the first time since hiring her, Richard felt a flicker of gratitude. He needed someone like Clara, someone who could navigate the labyrinth of lies and half-truths swirling around him. Because if Lydia was alive, Richard wasn't sure whether he should prepare for reconciliation or a reckoning. The Hope Haven orphanage stood on the outskirts of Manhattan, its weathered brick facade softened by ivy and the faint scent of lilacs carried on the breeze. It was a place where laughter mingled with quiet moments of reflection, a sanctuary built from tragedy but sustained by hope. For Richard Whitmore, it had been a way to honor Annalise's memory. Yet today it felt like another piece in an increasingly sinister puzzle. Clara Dawes stepped out of her car, her sharp eyes scanning the ground as she approached the main entrance. She hadn't told Richard about her hunch. There was no need to get his hopes up until she had something concrete. But something about Maya, the girl who vanished into thin air after warning him, had stuck with Clara. A child with no official record, living off the grid, speaking cryptically about ghosts. If anyone could help unravel this mystery, it might be the orphans themselves. Inside, the building buzzed with activity. Children raced down hallways, their laughter echoing through high ceilings adorned with faded murals of stars and dreamscapes. The staff greeted Clara warmly, recognizing her as one of Richard's associates, though they seemed curious about her unannounced visit. I'm looking for someone, Clara said to Sister Margaret, the head caretaker. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Her name is Maya. Sister Margaret frowned, her lined face creasing further in thought. Maya, I don't think we have a child by that name here. Clara pressed gently, pulling out a sketch she'd hastily drawn based on security footage. This is what she looks like. Could you ask around? The nun nodded, calling over 2 teenage volunteers to show the picture to the other children. While they dispersed, Clara wandered toward the back of the building, drawn by an intuition she couldn't quite explain. Something about the basement, a space rarely used except for storage, felt significant. Descending the creaking wooden stairs, she found herself in a dimly lit corridor lined with dusty shelves and forgotten relics. At the far end, a sliver of light spilled beneath a closed door. Clara moved silently, her hand brushing against the holster at her side before pushing the door open. There, curled up on a threadbare rug, sat Maya. Her oversized sweater swallowed her tiny frame, and her tangled hair fell across her face as she stared blankly at the wall. When she noticed Clara, her wide eyes filled with panic, and she scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner. It's okay, Clara said softly, crouching low to appear less threatening. I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Clara. I work with Mr. Whitmore. Maya hesitated, her lower lip trembling. He's in trouble, she whispered finally. That's why I came, to stop him. Clara nodded slowly, keeping her tone calm and steady. You did good, Maya. You saved his life. But I need your help now. Who sent you? Maya hugged her knees tighter, rocking slightly. The Whisper Lady. She told me he was in danger. She said the juice would take him away, just like it took others. Others? Clara asked, leaning forward slightly. Who else did the juice take? Maya shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. I only hear them sometimes. The ghosts of girls who never got to grow up. They cry when the sun goes down. They tell me things. Her voice trailed off, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Whether Maya's words were born of trauma, imagination, or something more inexplicable, they struck a nerve. Ghosts of girls who never grew up. It sounded like a reference to Annalise, but perhaps others too. What did the Whisper Lady look like? Clara prodded gently. Maya frowned, struggling to recall. She wears white, always white, and her voice is soft like wind through trees. She says I have to listen because I'm special, because I can hear them. Clara's mind raced. The description matched the woman in the enhanced security footage, the one who resembled Lydia. Was it possible that Lydia had reached out to Maya somehow? Or was the Whisper Lady someone else entirely? Somehow. And your daughter, Maya blurted suddenly, startling Clara. She told me to stop the juice. Clara froze, her breath catching. What did you say? Your daughter, Maya repeated, her gaze distant, as if reliving a memory. She came to me in my dreams. She said Daddy needs saving, that the bad thing will happen again if I don't stop it. Clara's heart pounded. This child, this fragile, frightened little girl, was claiming to have spoken with Annalise Whitmore, a girl who had died 30 years ago. It defied logic, yet Clara couldn't dismiss it outright, not after everything else she'd uncovered. Maya, Clara said carefully, how do you know about Richard's daughter? She told me, Maya insisted, her voice rising. She shows me pictures in my mind, happy ones, sad ones. She says Daddy misses her so much, and she wants him to find the truth about her, about everything. Clara exhaled slowly, trying to process what she was hearing. Whether Maya's claims were real or delusional didn't matter right now. What mattered was the connection she seemed to have forged with Annalise, and the role she might play in uncovering the truth behind both attacks. Okay, Maya, Clara said gently, extending a hand. Let's get you upstairs. You're safe now, but we need to talk more about the Whisper Lady and about what happened at the restaurant. Maya hesitated, then reached out tentatively, her small hand trembling in Clara's grasp. Together they climbed the stairs, leaving the shadows of the basement behind. As they emerged into the sunlight streaming through the orphanage windows, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Maya held the key to unlocking decades of buried secrets. The mention of Annalise, the whispers of lost girls, the cryptic warnings, all pointed to a deeper conspiracy than anyone had anticipated. And somewhere at the center of it all was Lydia, or whoever the woman in white truly was. Clara glanced down at Maya, whose pale face was streaked with tears, but also flickered with determination. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. The answers wouldn't come easily. But with each step closer to the truth, the stakes grew higher and the danger more personal. For Richard Whitmore, the journey wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about confronting the ghosts of his past and finding redemption for the family he'd lost. The fluorescent lights of the municipal archives buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over rows of dusty filing cabinets and microfiche machines. Clara Dawes sat at a scarred wooden table, her fingers stained with ink from decades-old documents. She had spent hours combing through yellowed case files, police reports, and coroner's notes, all remnants of an investigation that had been hastily closed 30 years ago. At first glance, Annalise Whitmore's death seemed straightforward. Accidental poisoning caused by a contaminated juice bottle. But as Clara peeled back the layers, inconsistencies began to surface. Small cracks in the official narrative that hinted at something far more sinister. The autopsy report was the first red flag. According to the coroner's notes, traces of a rare neurotoxin were found in Annalise's system. A compound so obscure it wasn't even commercially available at the time. Yet the police report listed the cause of death as accidental ingestion of household chemicals, a vague explanation that didn't align with the specifics of the toxin. Clara leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Whoever had handled this case had gone out of their way to cover up the truth. The question was why, and who had orchestrated it. Her search led her to a name buried deep within the files. Bridget O'Connell, the Whitmore family's nanny. A quick scan of employment records revealed she had vanished shortly after Annalise's death, leaving behind no forwarding address or explanation. What caught Clara's attention, however, was a single line in a police report filed just days before Annalise died. Bridget O'Connell alleges deliberate harm to minor child by mother Lydia Whitmore. Further investigation pending. Clara's pulse quickened. This was new information, something Richard hadn't mentioned during their discussions. If Bridget had suspected foul play, why hadn't anyone followed up on her claims? And what did she mean by deliberate harm? She dug deeper, piecing together fragments of interviews conducted with Bridget at the time. The nanny had described Lydia as increasingly erratic in the months leading up to Annalise's death, prone to fits of anger and unpredictable behavior. Bridget claimed she had witnessed Lydia tampering with Annalise's food and drinks multiple times, though she couldn't provide concrete evidence. When pressed, she admitted her accusations were based largely on intuition, but insisted she feared for Annalise's safety. Then just days later, Bridget disappeared without a trace. Her abrupt departure coincided with Annalise's death, raising questions about whether she'd fled out of fear or if someone had silenced her permanently. Clara jotted down notes furiously, her mind racing. If Lydia had indeed been involved in Annalise's poisoning, it would explain her sudden disappearance afterward. But why resurface now, decades later, only to target Richard? And how did Maya fit into all of this? Her thoughts turned to the woman in white, the figure captured on the security footage who bore such a striking resemblance to Lydia. Was it possible she hadn't acted alone? Could Bridget still be alive, working alongside her or against her? Clara pulled up a grainy photograph of Bridget from the file, studying it closely. The nanny appeared young, perhaps mid-20s, with curly auburn hair and sharp green eyes. There was a determination in her expression that suggested she wouldn't back down easily, even in the face of danger. As Clara sifted through the remaining documents, another detail caught her eye. A handwritten note scribbled in the margins of one report. It read, "Check storage unit hash 147. Evidence seized but never logged." Her heart skipped a beat. Evidence that had been seized but not officially recorded? That could mean anything, or everything. Whoever had tried to bury the truth about Annalise's death clearly hadn't wanted certain items to see the light of day. Clara tucked the note into her satchel, resolving to track down the storage facility where the unit was located. In the meantime, she needed to confront Richard with what she'd uncovered. He deserved to know that his ex-wife might not have been the grieving widow he remembered, but potentially a suspect in their daughter's murder. Back at Richard's penthouse, Clara spread the files across the dining table, watching his reaction carefully as he absorbed the revelations. His face went pale, then flushed with anger, his fists clenching as he read Bridget's allegations. "I never saw this report," he said hoarsely, his voice trembling. "If I had known—" "You wouldn't have let her walk away," Clara finished for him. "But someone made sure you didn't find out. Someone powerful enough to suppress evidence and manipulate the investigation." Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For 30 years, he had carried the guilt of Annalise's death, believing he should have done more to protect her. Now, faced with the possibility that Lydia might have been responsible, he felt the ground shift beneath him once again. "And Maya?" he asked finally, looking up at Clara. "What does she know? How does she fit into this?" "That's what we need to figure out," Clara replied. "But one thing is clear. Whoever is behind this wants you to remember. They're forcing you to confront the past, and they're using Annalise to do it." Richard stared at the photograph of his daughter, his jaw tightening. "Then let's make sure they regret it." For the first time, there was steel in his voice, resolve born of pain and fury. Whoever had orchestrated this twisted game had underestimated Richard Whitmore. They thought they could manipulate him, toy with his memories, and exploit his grief. But they had made one critical mistake. They had awakened a father's love and a man's thirst for justice. The Whitmore estate sprawled across acres of rolling green hills, its grandeur softened by the lazy charm of southern magnolias and live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, except within the walls of the house where tension simmered just beneath the surface. Lydia Whitmore stood on the wraparound porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her gaze was fixed on the backyard where Richard crouched beside Annalise, helping her string together a garland of wildflowers. Their laughter carried on the breeze, light and carefree, a sound that once brought Lydia joy but now filled her with an ache she couldn't name. She loved her daughter fiercely, perhaps too much. Every smile Annalise gave Richard felt like a betrayal. Every shared secret between them, a reminder of how little room there was for Lydia in their world. She had tried everything to bridge the gap, to be the mother Annalise needed. But nothing seemed to matter. Not when Richard was always there, larger than life, casting a shadow she couldn't escape. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Bridget's voice broke through her thoughts, tentative but firm. The young nanny hovered near the doorway, holding a tray of lemonade. "Shall I bring this out to them?" Lydia turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "No," she snapped. "Let them fend for themselves. They don't need you hovering over them either." Bridget hesitated, then set the tray down silently. She'd worked for the Whitmores for nearly 2 years, long enough to recognize the signs of Lydia's growing resentment. At first it had been subtle, sharp remarks about Richard spending too much time with Annalise, or dismissive comments about the child's quirks and habits. But lately it had escalated into something darker. That morning, Bridget had overheard another argument, louder than usual. Lydia accused Richard of neglecting her, of treating her like a second-class citizen in her own home. And when Annalise ran to her father for comfort, Lydia's expression had turned cold, almost menacing. Now, watching her pace the porch like a caged animal, Bridget felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right, and she feared what might happen if no one intervened. Later that afternoon, the air grew heavy with humidity as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Inside the house, Bridget busied herself tidying up Annalise's room, folding tiny dresses and stacking books neatly on the shelves. Through the open window, she could hear the distant rumble of thunder mingling with the faint strains of Richard reading aloud to his daughter. Then came the scream. Bridget dropped the book in her hands and raced downstairs, her heart pounding. In the kitchen, she found Lydia slumped against the counter, her face pale and tear-streaked. On the floor lay Annalise, convulsing violently, her small body racked with spasms. "What happened?" Bridget cried, dropping to her knees beside the girl. She said her juice tasted funny," Lydia stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think, oh God, help her." Bridget scooped Annalise into her arms and ran for the phone, dialing emergency services while cradling the child close. By the time paramedics arrived, the seizures had stopped, but so had Annalise's breathing. Hours later, after the coroner had taken Annalise's body and the police had questioned everyone involved, Bridget found herself alone in the dimly lit hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the weight of grief pressing down on every corner. Lydia had retreated to her bedroom, refusing to speak to anyone, while Richard sat in his study, staring blankly at the wall. Bridget knew she should leave, to pack her things and disappear before anyone realized what she had seen. But she couldn't bring herself to go, not without leaving proof. In the dead of night, she crept outside, clutching a small tin box. Inside was a cassette tape she had recorded earlier that week, capturing fragments of arguments between Lydia and Richard, along with her own observations about Lydia's increasingly erratic behavior. It wasn't much, but it was evidence, something tangible to back up her suspicions. Underneath the sprawling magnolia tree at the edge of the property, Bridget knelt and began to dig. The soil was soft from recent rain, and within minutes she had buried the box deep beneath the roots. She whispered a silent prayer as she patted the earth back into place, hoping someone would find it someday. As she rose to her feet, she glanced toward the house where lights still burned in Richard's study. She wanted to tell him everything, to warn him about Lydia, but fear held her back. Instead, she slipped quietly into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Little did she know, the secret she left behind would remain hidden for decades, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And beneath the magnolia tree, the truth waited patiently, tangled among the roots like a forgotten promise. The forensic labs smelled of antiseptic and faintly of burned coffee, a sterile contrast to the chaos unfolding in Clara Dawes' mind. She stood over a stainless steel counter, her eyes fixed on the analysis report spread before her. The results were conclusive, yet utterly chilling. Oleandrin, a toxin derived from oleander flowers, potent enough to stop a heart with just a trace amount. It was rare, nearly untraceable unless you knew exactly what to look for, and it was the same substance that had killed Annalise Whitmore 30 years ago. Clara exhaled sharply, leaning back against the counter as the implication sank in. Whoever had targeted Richard wasn't just copying the method. They were deliberately connecting the two incidents. This wasn't random or opportunistic. It was personal, calculated, designed to drag Richard and perhaps Lydia back into the past they thought they'd left behind. Her thoughts turned to the Whitmore estate in Mississippi, its sprawling grounds framed by towering magnolia trees and vibrant oleander bushes. The flowers weren't native to the region, but had been planted extensively around the property, a nod to Lydia's love for their delicate beauty. At the time, no one would have suspected the danger lurking in those blooms. But now, they seemed like an eerie calling card. Clara pulled out her phone and dialed Richard's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and weary. "Clara," he said, "please tell me you found something." "I have," she replied, her tone grave. "It's oleandrin, the same poison that killed Annalise. Someone went through a lot of trouble to use it again. And there's more." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Lydia's family estate in Mississippi, it was surrounded by oleander plants, dozens of them. If whoever did this wanted to send a message, this is it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, his voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "So we're saying Lydia might not only be involved in my attack, but also in Annalise's death?" "It's possible," Clara admitted, "but we can't jump to conclusions yet. We need proof and answers about Bridget O'Connell. She accused Lydia of deliberate harm days before Annalise died. Why would she do that unless she saw something?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Because she was protecting Annalise, just like Maya tried to protect me." Clara nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Exactly, which means we need to find Bridget or whatever evidence she left behind." "Have you heard anything about that storage unit?" "I'm working on it," Richard said tersely. "Eleanor is reaching out to the facility management as we speak." "But Clara," his voice softened, tinged with vulnerability, If Lydia really had something to do with Annalise's death, I don't know how I'll face that. You'll face it because you have to, Clara replied firmly. For Annalise, for yourself, and maybe even for Maya, who seems to believe your daughter wants justice too. Richard didn't respond immediately, and Clara could hear the weight of his silence pressing down on him. Finally, he sighed. Keep digging. Find Bridget. Find the truth. Whatever it takes. Later that evening, Clara sat at her desk, poring over maps of the Whitmore estate, Mississippi. Her laptop screen displayed satellite images of the property, the dense clusters of oleander bushes clearly visible along the perimeters. She zoomed in on one particular area, the backyard where the magnolia tree stood sentinel near the edge of the lawn. Something about that tree nagged at her. Maya's fragmented memories, her talk of ghosts and voices guiding her, it all felt tied to the land itself. And then there was Bridget, who had vanished without a trace after accusing Lydia of harm. Had she left clues behind? Something buried beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed? Clara grabbed her notebook and jotted down a reminder to check local records for any activity related to the estate since the Whitmores sold it decades ago. If someone had returned to the property recently, or if Lydia herself had gone back, it could explain how the poison had been sourced. As she worked, her phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. It was from a contact at the NYPD archives, a scanned copy of Bridget's last known address before she disappeared. The timing lined up perfectly. She had moved abruptly just days after Annalise's death, leaving behind unpaid rent and a hastily packed apartment. But what caught Clara's attention most was the postmark on one of Bridget's letters. A small town in Louisiana, less than 2 hours from the Whitmore estate. Could she have fled south, seeking refuge close enough to keep watch, but far enough to stay hidden? Clara leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as the pieces began to fall into place. Oleandrin, oleanders, the magnolia tree, Bridget's accusations, and now Lydia's reappearance in Richard's life, or someone pretending to be her. Whoever was behind this wasn't just seeking revenge. They were rewriting history, forcing Richard to confront the sins of his past, and perhaps exposing secrets that should have stayed buried forever. Clara reached for her coat, her mind made up. Tomorrow she would head to Mississippi. The answers lay beneath the magnolia tree, and she intended to dig them up, no matter how deep they were buried. The drive to Mississippi was long and quiet, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air between Clara and Richard. The landscape shifted from urban sprawl to rolling countryside, dotted with weathered barns and fields of golden grass. As they approached the gates of the Whitmore estate, Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It's been decades, he murmured, almost to himself. I haven't stepped foot here since we left. Clara glanced at him, noting the strain etched across his face. You don't have to do this alone, she said softly. We're here for answers, for Annalise. Richard nodded but said nothing, his gaze fixed ahead as he guided the car down the overgrown driveway. The once majestic estate now stood in disrepair, its grand columns cracked and its windows boarded up. Nature had begun reclaiming the property, vines snaking up the walls and wildflowers blooming where manicured gardens once thrived. But it was the magnolia tree that drew their attention, a towering sentinel at the edge of the yard, its gnarled roots spreading wide like ancient fingers clutching the earth. Beneath its shade, the soil looked disturbed, as if someone had recently dug there, or perhaps decades ago, leaving behind faint traces of their work. This is it, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against dry leaves. Clara followed, carrying a small shovel she'd brought just in case. They began digging carefully, the damp soil yielding easily under their efforts. After several minutes, the tip of the shovel struck something solid, a metallic clang that sent a jolt through both of them. Clara crouched down, brushing away dirt to reveal a rusted tin box, its edges corroded by time but still intact. With trembling hands, Richard pried it open. Inside was a single cassette tape, its label faded but legible. For Richard, she did it. Richard froze, staring at the words as if they might burn him. His breath hitched, and he handed the tape to Clara without a word. She slipped it into a portable player she'd brought along, pressing play. Static crackled before Bridget's voice emerged, shaky but resolute. It was clear she had recorded this in haste, her fear palpable even through the grainy audio. Mr. Whitmore, if you're hearing this, then something terrible has happened, to me or to Annalise. I didn't know who else to tell, so I'm leaving this here, hoping someday you'll find it. Please believe me when I say I love your daughter more than anything. That's why I have to warn you about Lydia. A sob broke through her words, and she paused to steady herself. She wasn't well, Mr. Whitmore. Not for a long time. Her jealousy of you, it ate at her. She hated how much Annalise adored you, how close you were. One night after another argument, I overheard her talking to herself. She said she wanted to hurt you, to make you feel the same pain she felt every day watching you with Annalise. And then she mentioned the oleander flowers outside. Bridget's voice cracked again, and she took a shaky breath. I think she planned to poison Annalise, to punish you. But something went wrong. Maybe she meant to stop it, or maybe she lost control. All I know is that Annalise collapsed, and Lydia acted like she didn't understand what happened. But I saw the look on her face, Mr. Whitmore. She knew, and when Annalise died, Lydia disappeared. Just like that. Another pause, longer this time. I'm scared, Mr. Whitmore. Scared for my life. If Lydia finds out I know, she'll come after me too. That's why I'm leaving. But please, don't let her get away with this. Don't let her destroy everything you built together. For Annalise's sake, and yours. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Clara turned off the player, her heart pounding. Beside her, Richard sank to his knees, clutching the tape as if it might slip through his fingers. She killed her, he whispered hoarsely, tears streaming down his face. My own wife. She killed our daughter. Clara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. We don't know all the details yet, she said gently, but we have proof now. This changes everything. Richard wiped his eyes, his grief giving way to a steely resolve. No, he said firmly. This doesn't change everything. It confirms it. Lydia isn't just involved in what happened last night. She's responsible for Annalise's death. And whoever's helping her now, they're trying to finish what she started. Clara nodded, rising to her feet. Then we need to act fast. If Lydia is alive, and if she knows we found this, she won't stop until she silences us permanently. As they stood beneath the magnolia tree, the wind rustling through its leaves, Richard felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. For 30 years he had carried the guilt of losing Annalise, believing he should have done more to protect her. Now, faced with the truth, he realized the fault lay not with him, but with the woman he had once loved. And somewhere out there, Lydia, or whoever she had become, was waiting to see if he would remember, waiting to see if he would fight back. Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wouldn't let her win. Not this time. Not ever. For Annalise, he said aloud, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. And for Maya, whoever she is, she risked everything to stop this. We owe it to her and to Annalise to finish it. Clara nodded, her expression grim but determined. Together they walked back to the car, the cassette tape tucked safely in Richard's coat pocket. The past had finally caught up with them, but so had the tools to bring justice to those who had tried to bury the truth. And justice, Richard vowed, would be served. The rooftop restaurant of the Skyline Grand buzzed with anticipation once more, though this time the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of tension. Reporters and guests mingled uneasily, their whispers betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. Richard Whitmore stood near the podium, his tailored suit immaculate as always, but his eyes betrayed a steely resolve. Beneath his lapel, hidden from view, was a wire connected to Clara Dawes's earpiece. Clara sat at a corner table, her gaze sharp and unwavering as she scanned the room. The plan was simple, yet risky. Lure Lydia, or whoever had been impersonating her, back into the open by staging another public appearance. If she thought Richard was vulnerable again, she might take the bait. And if she did, they would be ready. Eleanor Brooks hovered nearby, pretending to adjust Richard's tie, while surreptitiously checking in with Clara via a discreet earpiece. Everything's set, Eleanor murmured, her voice low. Security's on high alert, and NYPD is standing by. Richard nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. He hated using himself as bait, but there was no other way. Whoever had orchestrated these attacks wasn't just targeting him. They were taunting him, forcing him to confront the ghosts of his past. Tonight, he intended to turn the tables. As the event began, Richard stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding immediate silence. Cameras flashed, capturing every nuance of his composed demeanor as he delivered a brief, rehearsed speech about resilience and redemption. But beneath the polished exterior, his mind raced, every sense attuned to the possibility of danger. Then, halfway through his remarks, it happened. A figure slipped through the crowd, a woman in a flowing white dress, her movements deliberate yet graceful. Her face was unmistakable now, aged but still bearing the haunting resemblance to Lydia Whitmore. She moved toward the buffet table where servers bustled with trays of hors d'oeuvres and drinks. No one noticed as her gloved hand reached for a decanter of juice, slipping something small and metallic into it. Clara spotted her instantly, her pulse quickening. "She's here," Clara whispered into her microphone. "White dress, near the buffet. Moving in 3, 2. Before Clara could finish, chaos erupted, not from the police or security, but from an unexpected source. From beneath the buffet table emerged Maya, her small frame darting forward like a streak of lightning. With a fierce cry, she lunged at the woman in white, grabbing her ankle and yanking hard. The woman stumbled, her balance lost, and crashed to the floor with a startled gasp. The vials she'd been holding clattered across the marble tiles, its contents spilling harmlessly onto the ground. Pandemonium broke loose. Guests screamed and scattered as uniformed officers surged forward, pinning the woman down before she could recover. Clara rushed to Maya, pulling the girl protectively behind her as the scene unfolded. Richard abandoned the podium, striding toward the commotion with grim determination. As the officers hauled the woman upright, her hood fell back, revealing a face that left no room for doubt. It was Lydia, older, wearier, but undeniably the same woman who had vanished decades ago. Her eyes met Richard's, wide with shock and something else. Regret? Defiance? It was impossible to tell. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of 30 years pressing down on them both. "You shouldn't have come back," Richard said finally, his voice cold and steady. "You should have stayed gone." Lydia didn't respond, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. Officers cuffed her hands behind her back, reading her rights aloud as they led her away. But the story wasn't over yet. Back at the precinct, forensic analysis confirmed what Clara and Richard had suspected. Fingerprints on the vial matched those lifted from evidence files related to Annalise's death. Decades-old records had finally caught up with Lydia, tying her irrefutably to the poison used in both incidents. Sitting in an interrogation room, Lydia looked frail, her defiance replaced by resignation. Across the table, Clara observed silently, letting Richard take the lead. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice heavy with pain. "After all these years, why come back now?" Lydia stared at her hands, bound loosely in front of her. "I never wanted it to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not to Annalise. I only wanted you to hurt, to feel the emptiness I felt every day watching you love her more than me." "But you killed her!" Richard shot back, his voice rising. "You poisoned our daughter because you were jealous?" "I didn't mean to," Lydia cried, tears streaming down her face. I thought I could scare you, make you see how much you needed me. But when she collapsed, I panicked. I ran because I couldn't face what I'd done." "And now," Clara interjected, leaning forward, "why target Richard again after all this time?" Lydia hesitated, her gaze flickering between them. "Because he found peace without me," she admitted bitterly. "He built his empire, founded that orphanage. He moved on, I couldn't let him forget. Not after what I lost. Her words hung heavy in the air, a twisted justification for decades of guilt and rage. But Richard wasn't interested in excuses. You'll never hurt anyone else, he said firmly, rising to leave. Not my daughter, not me, and certainly not Maya. Outside the station, Maya clung to Clara's side, her tiny hand gripping tightly. Richard knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You saved me again, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Maya. You're braver than most adults I know. Maya smiled faintly, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. Your daughter told me to stop her, she murmured. She said you deserve to be happy. Richard blinked back tears, pulling the girl into a careful embrace. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for justice, but for healing. Annalise's memory would always be with him, but now, perhaps, he could begin to honor it in a way that brought light instead of darkness. As the sun rose over Manhattan, casting golden rays across the city skyline, Richard Whitmore walked away from the precinct, flanked by Clara and Maya. Justice had been served, but the journey ahead promised challenges and redemption for them all. The courtroom was solemn, its heavy wooden benches filled with spectators who whispered in hushed tones about the case that had captivated headlines for weeks. Lydia Whitmore sat stoically at the defendant's table, her once proud bearing diminished by the weight of her crimes. As the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts, Richard Whitmore felt no joy, only a profound emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the pain of 30 years or bring back the daughter he had lost. In the days that followed, Richard returned to the Skyline Grand one final time, not to confront danger, but to fulfill a promise. The rooftop restaurant gleamed under the afternoon sun, its opulence softened by the presence of children from Hope Haven, their laughter filling the space with warmth. This time there were no threats, no hidden motives, only gratitude and hope. Standing before the gathered crowd, Richard held up a ceremonial check for $50 million, his voice steady as he addressed the audience. Today, this donation isn't just in honor of my daughter Annalise, he began, his eyes glistening. It's also for Maya, a brave little girl who reminded me that love endures, even in the face of unimaginable loss. He paused, glancing down at Maya, who stood beside him, clutching his hand tightly. Her tangled hair had been brushed into neat braids, and she wore a bright yellow dress Eleanor had picked out especially for the occasion. Despite her small frame, she carried herself with quiet courage, her wide eyes taking in the sea of faces around her. And so, Richard continued, I dedicate this gift to two remarkable girls who changed my life forever. One who taught me how to love unconditionally, and another who showed me the strength of the human spirit. Together they will inspire generations of children to come. The room erupted in applause, but Richard barely heard it. His focus remained on Maya, whose smile lit up the space like sunlight breaking through clouds. When the ceremony ended, he bent down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're coming home with me today, he said softly, if you'll have me. Maya's lower lip trembled, and she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him fiercely. Yes, she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I want to be your family. Later that evening, as they walked hand in hand through the gates of Hope Haven for the last time, the air felt lighter, charged with possibility. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Maya stopped suddenly, tugging gently on Richard's hand. Will your daughter still talk to me? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Now that I'm not helping her anymore? Richard froze, his heart swelling with emotion. For months, Maya had spoken of Annalise as if she were a living presence, guiding her, urging her to act. At first, he had dismissed it as a child's imagination, born of trauma or grief. But now, standing beneath the vast expanse of twilight, he wasn't so sure. He turned to Maya, kneeling so they were eye to eye. I think she'll always talk to you, he said, his voice thick with tears, Because you gave her back her voice. You made sure the world wouldn't forget her. Maya tilted her head, considering his words. Then she nodded solemnly, as if satisfied with the answer. She reached out and took his hand again, leaning into him as they continued walking toward the waiting car. As they drove away, Richard glanced out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light. He thought of Annalise, the sound of her laughter, the way she used to chase butterflies in the garden, and allowed himself to imagine her watching over them now. Perhaps she had guided Maya to him, leading them both toward a future neither could have envisioned alone. When they arrived at the penthouse, Maya ran ahead, exploring every corner of her new home with wide-eyed wonder. Richard lingered on the balcony, staring up at the night sky. Somewhere among the stars, he felt a quiet reassurance, a sense that Annalise was finally at peace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carried away by the breeze, "for bringing her to me." And though no words came in reply, Richard didn't need them. In the silence, he found solace. For the first time in decades, he believed love could transcend even death, and that maybe, just maybe, Annalise would always be part of their lives. As Maya called out to him from inside, her laughter echoing through the halls, Richard stepped back into the warmth of his home, ready to begin anew.